I used to think my silence made things easier for them. The photo came in like anything else these days, quietly, inside a message thread I was no longer a part of, forwarded by mistake from a former neighbor who hadn't realized I wasn't supposed to see it. A long dining table stretched across the frame. My table. White plates I had picked out in 2003. Crystal glasses gifted by my sister-in-law the year Greg got promoted. Greg was in the center, lifting a glass mid-sentence. Lauren smiled from the far end like a practiced hostess. There were 3 empty chairs. One of them should have been mine. No one had called. I didn't scroll further. I placed the phone face down next to my cup, which had long since cooled. The ring around the bottom was darker than usual. A faint line of coffee had dried along the rim, just enough to stain my thumb when I picked it up. A few years ago, I might have called Greg and asked if the dinner was impromptu. I might have said lightly that I hoped everyone had fun, that I missed being there, that the roast chicken I used to make for Sunday dinners wasn't too dry without me. But I didn't call, I didn't message. I opened the drawer in the cabinet instead, the one I hadn't opened in months. The papers were still there, stacked neatly. Not because I'd read them recently, but because touching them again would confirm what I had already suspected. I flipped past insurance policies and old phone bills until I reached the housing file. I removed the last document, the title transfer, the one we signed together when Greg and Lauren said it was time to consolidate everything under household management. He had used a blue pen that day. My pen. The one I had given him after his first case. Silver-plated with his initials etched on the side. I remembered handing it to him at the table. Remembered how proud he looked using it. I found that same pen today at the bottom of the drawer, untouched the cap, slightly bent, no ink left. Dust had settled into the crease between the cap and barrel. I left it there. The new document had no surprises. Gregory Allen Wallace Sole Holder. There were initials on every page. Not mine. Later that evening, while refolding laundry I hadn't worn in years, the phone buzzed once. Just once. A message. I recognized the tone before I even read the screen. "Mom, don't come to these anymore. It's all settled." That was the entire message. No greeting, no explanation. Just that. Settled. I stared at the word. Not cruel. Not angry. Settled. As if I had been a matter to resolve, a detail to finalize. I didn't reply. Instead, I pulled a cardigan from the bottom of the basket. The one with the worn cuffs and one button missing. I used to keep it near the back door for evenings on the porch. Greg had once told me I looked like a librarian in it. That was before Lauren moved the porch furniture into storage and said the view made guests feel exposed. The cardigan smelled faintly of cedar and something older, perhaps the lemon oil I used on the floorboards. I wrapped it around myself and stood in the hallway, not walking, not thinking, just listening. I used to be able to hear his voice down these halls. Arguments about missing soccer cleats, rushed goodbyes before school, the thud of his bag against the wall when he came home late from college and didn't want to talk. There had been no argument this time. No slammed door. No accusation. Just subtraction. And I suppose in its own way that hurt more. Because you can't respond to what isn't spoken. They hadn't taken the house with shouting. They hadn't thrown my things on the lawn. They'd waited for me to step out of the center. And when I did, they folded the edges inward until there was no space left. The room felt too bright, so I turned off the overhead light and sat at the dining table. Mine was the only chair pushed in. I used to scold Greg for leaving his pulled out. He used to say, "It's just a chair, Mom." I wonder if he thinks that now when he sees my name missing from things. The phone lit up once more. Not Greg this time. Lauren. Just a picture of Noah holding a trophy at a school event. She didn't write anything, no caption, no wish you were there, just the image. I looked at his face, half smiling, uncertain. I remembered the night he was born. The nurse handed him to me, first not Lauren. Lauren had been groggy. I had held him while Greg filled out paperwork. He weighed less than a winter coat. I hummed a tune I hadn't sung in years and thought maybe that would be enough for him to remember me. Now he was taller than Lauren, broad-shouldered like Greg was at that age. The trophy was crooked in his hand. I couldn't tell what it was for. I turned the phone over again. A long crack ran along the table's surface, not deep, but visible under the right light. I had tried to sand it down once, but the grain split too far. Some things don't fill cleanly once they've fractured. I reached out and placed the silver pen across the crack. It didn't cover it, but it looked intentional. I stayed like that for a long time. Hands still, cardigan sleeves covering my wrists. Ring finger bare since the day I took off my wedding band without thinking. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I only listened for a voice that didn't call, and chose again not to answer. Not everything I gave was meant to be remembered. When I moved back in with Greg, I packed only 4 boxes. One was books, mostly legal texts I could no longer recite but didn't have the heart to discard. Another held kitchen tools too familiar to part with, a paring knife worn thin, a teapot with a chip that always faced the wall. The third was filled with photographs. Some framed, some loose, some so faded, the color had gone entirely. The last box was shoes, practical ones. I left behind everything else, including the mirror I'd once kept on my dresser. There didn't seem to be a reason to bring my own reflection anymore. Lauren had said it's just temporary, until we find the right setup. She didn't say for whom. The guest room was smaller than I remembered, and the bedding had been replaced with a neutral gray that didn't match anything I owned. The closet had a lingering scent of lavender sachets and cedar, but the floor was clean and the drawer handles clicked firmly into place. Greg patted the doorframe once with his palm and looked past me into the hallway. "You'll be more comfortable down here. That way you won't have to go up and down." I had no trouble with stairs, but I smiled and placed my boxes neatly along the wall. Noah had just started 2nd grade then. He would knock on my door before school to show me mismatched socks or ask for a different breakfast than the one Lauren had prepared. I never corrected him. I simply fixed it and wiped the counter before she came downstairs. I learned their rhythms. Lauren liked silence in the mornings, Greg answered work calls in the garage, and neither of them liked the thermostat above 68. I adjusted. I made myself scarce in the evenings. I watered the plants when no one was watching. I remembered not to use the front burner because it clicked too loud. When Lauren was pregnant with Emily, the nights grew longer. I kept a baby monitor in my room, not because they asked, but because the walls weren't as thick as they thought. I heard the pacing. I heard the bottle warmers. I heard Greg's voice soft, worn, unsure. And when they needed rest, I simply appeared, held the baby, and hummed old shapeless melodies. Lauren once handed me a folded burp cloth and said, "You're good with the gaps." I didn't ask what she meant. When Greg started his firm, the numbers didn't quite stretch. He came to me on a Saturday morning standing too straight with a smile too wide. "I want to build something we can all be proud of." I handed him the check without folding it. He didn't count it in front of me, and I didn't ask for it back. 3 weeks later, they converted the upstairs office into a nursery. I was moved downstairs. "Makes more sense this way," Greg said. "That room gets too much sun." I folded the bed sheets from the linen closet, moved my boxes again, and made space for a rocking chair beside the window. The curtain rods were loose. I fixed them myself with an old screwdriver I kept from my husband's drawer. No one asked how I slept. I made dinners when schedules overlapped, stayed out of pictures when company came over, and learned to smile without entering conversations. I paid for piano lessons when Lauren lost her job, signed field trip forms when Greg forgot, and never once brought up the birthday he missed. Mine, not his. One afternoon, while dusting the built-in shelves in the family room, I found a photo half tucked behind a row of real estate manuals. It was one I thought had been lost, a picture of Greg at 10, wearing a striped sweater I had knitted too big on purpose. My husband stood behind him, both of them holding the tail of a kite that never quite lifted. I was to the left, eyes squinting, mouth open, mid-laugh. I held it a moment longer than I should have, then placed it behind the books again. It didn't belong on the mantel anymore. Greg once told me, without looking up from his phone, "You don't have to do all this. No one expects it." Lauren said, "We're trying to create our own structure, you know." No one used the word replace, but it hung in the air like steam over a cup gone cold. During Christmas 2 years ago, I wrapped presents in brown paper with green twine. When Noah unwrapped his, he paused and looked at Lauren before thanking me. She was already opening something else. Greg was outside shoveling a driveway that didn't have much snow. I never asked for recognition. I just folded the paper scraps neatly and put them in the recycling. Last spring, Lauren reorganized the pantry. She labeled each shelf, color-coded the bins, and moved my tea to the top. When I reached for it on tiptoe, she watched from across the room. Maybe we should think about setting some boundaries. It's healthier that way. She didn't say for whom. The same week, Greg changed the password on the shared family account. He told me he was simplifying things, merging files, streamlining. I didn't argue. I just stopped checking. The worst part wasn't the reassignment of space or the fading of voice in family decisions, or even the sense that I had become a placeholder in someone else's house. It was the realization that I had been temporary all along, that my effort was a courtesy they never asked for, that every small thing I thought was anchoring me to them had been quietly loosened behind my back. I once believed I was helping to preserve a structure, but foundations don't notice who sweeps the dust beneath their beams. I still keep that photograph, not in a frame, just folded carefully behind a book about estate law. The kite never flew, but we held the string anyway. That's what I remember, and that's enough. Some memories are not made of sound, but of pauses. I kept the card inside an old book about canning. Not because I was interested in preserving fruit, but because the spine was thick enough to hide folded things. The card was glossy, store-bought, printed in cursive, with metallic blue lettering that flaked when touched. Wishing you the best. Inside, no handwriting beyond a single line from all of us. No names, no date, no ink smudge from a rushed signature, just that. I didn't throw it away. I tucked it between pages I never read and pressed it flat with the weight of everything that hadn't been said. The card had arrived 2 days after my 70th birthday. Greg had sent a message the morning of. One line. "Happy birthday, Mom. Can't talk back-to-back meetings today." He didn't call that evening. I reheated soup I hadn't meant to make. No one knocked. Lauren posted a picture of Emily's science project online that same night. There were 23 likes. I didn't mention the card. I simply placed it on the kitchen table for a day, then moved it to the book. That was enough of a ceremony. Years before, at a neighborhood fundraiser, I stood near the back of a crowded hall while Greg delivered a speech. He had just been appointed to the local planning board. I held my breath when he glanced toward the audience. He was wearing the tie I had picked out for him last Christmas, dark navy, with a subtle thread of silver. His voice was clear, confident, polished. He thanked his colleagues, his mentor from law school, and Lauren for balancing everything. There was a pause where my name might have belonged. I filled it in myself silently, then folded my hands and listened through the rest. Noah had fallen asleep in my lap by the time the applause began. Greg walked past me after it was over, his hand resting briefly on my shoulder. "You should have moved up front," he murmured without looking. I had been early. The front seats were already saved. I remembered the first time he called Lauren's mother Mom. It slipped out while they were repacking boxes during their first move. I was helping wrap the glassware. He stood across the room handing something delicate to the woman who had only recently become part of our lives. Careful with that, Mom. He didn't notice. Lauren glanced at me, then looked away before I could decide whether I had imagined the shift. Later that evening, while unloading silverware, she said, "You're like a second mother to Greg. Like, second." I didn't correct her. I stopped mentioning the box of baby pictures I had meant to give him. They remained under my bed, neatly labeled, organized by year. He never asked. One Sunday, I brought up the subject of my will, not forcefully, not dramatically. Just a quiet suggestion over coffee between slices of toast. I think it's time to revisit some of the documents. Greg kept reading something on his phone. "It's taken care of." I waited. "Really, Mom? You don't need to worry about all that anymore. I've got it covered." That was the end of the conversation. No questions. No papers reviewed. No room left to ask what covered meant. I didn't bring it up again. At Christmas the year before, I had wrapped a letter inside Greg's gift. Not a letter, really, just a short note about something I remembered from his childhood. The time he stayed home sick for 3 days, and we read every book on the second shelf of his room. He had told me then, between coughs, that he wanted to be a helper for people. I wrote those words on the note, folded it into the sleeve of a new wool sweater, and tied the box with green twine. He opened it quickly, thanked me with a distracted nod, and set the sweater aside. The note was never mentioned. I don't know if he ever saw it. Lauren's gift was a leather-bound planner with his initials embossed on the front. He held it longer. I once overheard a conversation between Lauren and a friend on the phone. I had walked into the kitchen quietly. She didn't see me standing in the hallway. "Oh, she's harmless," she said, laughter just under the surface. "Honestly, she means well. She just holds on to things." I backed away before the sentence finished. I knew what I held. Old curtains folded too many times. Receipts from Noah's first trip to the aquarium. A set of keys to a mailbox that no longer existed. I held pieces because they weren't handed back. I never asked Greg why he stopped keeping my casserole dishes. He returned one in a bag with the lid missing. "Lauren likes using glass ones now," he had said. I nodded, took it, didn't ask for the rest. The shelf where I kept their wedding photo began to collect dust. I stopped wiping it, not out of protest, but because I wanted to see what would settle. The last time I was at their house for a holiday dinner, Lauren pulled me aside before dessert. "We're trying to create a more modern structure for the kids." I waited. You know, new rhythms, new traditions, just so things don't get cluttered. I looked at the children's drawings on the fridge. The centerpiece I had made with pine cones. The chipped dish that used to be mine. I nodded, left early. Greg walked me to his door, said thanks for making the effort. Effort. As if the act of showing up was a performance, not a place I used to belong. I stepped outside that night without taking a container of leftovers. The wind had picked up. I zipped my coat halfway and didn't look back. I used to think gratitude was something you could recognize even when unspoken. A glance, a pause, a chair pulled out without needing to ask. But I don't remember Greg ever saying thank you with his whole voice. Not once. Not at a dinner. Not in passing. Not even when I stepped in so he could sleep or work or leave. Maybe he didn't think I needed it. Maybe he was right. But the book stays where it is, and the card remains inside. Flat. Unsigned. Quiet is its own kind of ink. I used to think I would recognize betrayal by its volume. The call from the bank was polite. Routine even, A courtesy alert about an unusually large withdrawal from an account that until that moment I believed hadn't been touched in years. It was an old joint account, one I had opened when Greg first mentioned the idea of having a safety net for family emergencies. I remembered signing the papers in a waiting room, Greg beside me, tapping his pen against the clipboard. He'd said something about convenience, about keeping things in one place. I didn't question it. The withdrawal was specific, high enough to sting, just low enough not to trigger formal investigation. I thanked the banker and ended the call. Then I sat with my hands resting on my lap, palms down, fingers still. A soft humming filled my ears, like the sound of an old refrigerator when it cycles on. Greg was in the kitchen that evening, speaking softly into his phone and slicing into an orange he wouldn't finish. When I stood beside the counter, he didn't look up. "There was a withdrawal," I said. He didn't pause. "I moved it into the development project, the one I mentioned last month. I hadn't remembered a project." I said nothing. He placed the knife in the sink. "It was time, Mom. You've been overwhelmed lately. I've stepped in to manage everything else. It made sense." I opened my mouth. Nothing came. Greg reached into a drawer and pulled out a thin folder. He laid it flat on the counter and opened it halfway, as though to display something familiar. "You signed this, remember? It was part of the insurance paperwork. Just a limited power of attorney, so I could help with forms." I studied the page. My signature was there, crooked, a little rushed. The kind of signature I gave when I thought I was agreeing to something simple, something temporary. Below it was Greg's darker, deliberate pressed deep into the paper, like it had somewhere to go. There was a red check mark beside financial discretion. I remembered the form, the day he brought it. Lauren had left a casserole on the table and gone upstairs without speaking. Greg had said something about simplifying procedures, about not having to bother me with every decision. I had signed it between folding laundry and setting the oven timer. Greg tapped the paper now. "You don't have to worry about all this anymore. I've got it." He used that phrase again, as if control was a kindness, as if erasure was a service. I left the paper on the counter and walked upstairs. The hall light flickered once, then held steady. My room was, as I had left it, quiet, folded, obedient. I sat at the desk and pulled open the drawer with my private files. A few years ago, I'd started keeping backup copies of things: bank statements, insurance letters, scanned identification. Not because I distrusted anyone, just habit. Page by page, I went through them. My name was gone from the property deed, from the secondary checking account, from the medical directive I had written with my own notary. In their place, Gregory Wallace custodian, or primary, or simply nothing at all. I ran my fingers along the edge of one paper. It had a raised seal. It used to say co-owner. Now it said authorized occupant. That night, Lauren walked past me on the landing. She didn't stop. She didn't comment on dinner or ask about my plans. But as she passed Greg in the stairwell, I heard her say, soft, deliberate, "She'll adjust. They always do." She didn't mean women. She meant mothers. That sentence landed like a lid being closed. Final, precise. Not cruel, just expected. I sat at the edge of my bed and unfolded the form Greg had shown me. My own signature looked out of place, slanted beside his, the way an afterthought leans away from the rest of the sentence. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't accused. He hadn't shamed me in front of anyone. He had simply moved me out of the narrative. Years ago, I had told him to double knot his shoelaces, or they'd come loose without him noticing. He'd rolled his eyes and said, "I've got it." The loop had dragged through mud within the hour. Now the shoelace was the deed to the house, the bank access, the invisible title I used to carry when someone introduced me as Greg's mother. I didn't tear the form. I didn't crumple it. I just refolded it, set it beside my lamp, and turned the bulb one notch dimmer. There was no scene, no confrontation, no moment that could be replayed in someone else's retelling. Only ink, only a check mark, only the quiet knowledge that I had already signed myself away somewhere between trusting and not needing to ask, and that they had counted on it. Some exits begin days before the door opens. I had known for some time. It wasn't a moment or a conversation, just a quiet series of acknowledgments. Keys moved without explanation. Bills with signatures that weren't mine rooms that no longer waited for my return. The morning I left the house still slept. I moved without rushing, not from fear of being caught, but because noise no longer belonged to me. My steps didn't echo. I opened the closet slowly. Not everything needed to come. I chose the sweater with the uneven hem. It had stretched over time loose in the shoulders now, but still smelled faintly of wool and lemon soap. The sleeves had been rolled 3 times and never unrolled. The suitcase sat where it always had, beneath the bench behind the coats no one wore. Green canvas slightly bowed on one side, the same one my husband had taken on business trips in the early years. The handle still bore a faint scratch from the metal railing at Union Station. I hadn't used it in over a decade. I opened it carefully, laid the sweater flat, followed by the album I hadn't shown anyone in years. I skipped the heavy frames. I brought the printouts instead, loose photos curled at the edges, soft with wear. Most of them were from before Greg could speak in full sentences. One book. The one with margins I had written in. A faded corner where I'd once spilled tea. A note inside the back cover with a list I no longer recognized. A small wooden box. Inside a ring, I no longer wore a receipt from a train ride I took alone in 1991, and a button from Greg's first coat. The button was cracked now. I didn't remember when it broke. I left everything else. Lauren had rearranged the cabinets last spring. My tea had been placed on the top shelf behind the supplements and protein powders. When I mentioned it, she had smiled faintly. Maybe it's time we simplify things a bit. I hadn't answered. That same week, Greg had left a folder on the counter half opened. Inside were updated records. My name wasn't in them. When I asked, he waved it off with one hand. It's just easier this way. You've had a lot on your plate. He hadn't looked at me when he said it. I folded a note that morning, not large, not dramatic. I used one of the pages from the notepad by the fridge. The top corner had a printed peach on it. You were the reason I kept trying. Now I'd like to stop trying to stay. No signature, no farewell. I left it under the edge of the fruit bowl. The last thing I touched was the towel in the downstairs bathroom. It had frayed at the edges, but no one noticed except me. I folded it once, placed it over the rail, and didn't look back. I didn't call a cab. I didn't tell anyone I was going. The suitcase rolled unevenly over the entryway tile. One wheel clicked, with every turn a small, unsteady sound. I didn't lift it. Noah's science fair project was still on the table. Popsicle sticks and glue. I had helped with the base. No one remembered that. I opened the side door. The hinges no longer squeaked. Someone must have oiled them last week. It wasn't me. The sidewalk outside was cracked near the second square. I stepped around it out of habit. Greg once told me that nobody notices the hairline fractures unless they trip over them. It was meant to be funny. It stayed with me for different reasons. I walked to the bus stop, 2 blocks down. The bench had rust along the underside, but the paint held. I sat with the suitcase beside me. One woman nodded. I nodded back. The ride was quiet. I kept one hand on the strap, even though no one tried to take anything. I had chosen the neighborhood carefully, far enough not to be convenient, close enough not to feel final. The apartment complex was small. Brick plain, a little uneven in the gutters. It had once belonged to a man who sold typewriters. My husband had lived here in college. He used to say the place smelled like ambition and cigarette ash. I opened the door with the new key. The room was bare, but not hollow. The bed frame was simple. No mirror. No photos on the wall. I didn't bring any nails. I placed the suitcase in the corner. I didn't unpack. I didn't open the blinds. I didn't turn on music. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the radiator settle. My phone remained in the outer pocket of the suitcase. I didn't reach for it. That evening, I folded the sweater I had brought and placed it on the chair near the window. The fabric sagged slightly. One cuff still held a small thread from a button I had never sewn back on. I stood in front of the door for a while. The lock turned easily. I locked it once, not twice. The double lock had always been habit, protection, reassurance, an old echo of caring too much about what might be taken. This time, I turned it once. Nothing I carried could be stolen, and no one I had left behind would try to come in. I didn't know how quiet could feel different. This silence wasn't the kind that sat beside judgment or hid behind walls of unspoken things. It didn't press on my shoulders. It just was. The apartment had a chipped corner near the kitchen sink and a heater that ticked when it warmed. The linoleum floor bore faint patterns from the 1970s, dulled by time but not erased. I laid my sweater, the one with a stretched collar, over the back of the only chair that didn't wobble. A mug with a hairline crack held weak tea. The radio sat on the sill, tuned low enough that I could hear the gaps between the piano notes. The cupboards had mismatched cups. I chose one with a faded red stripe and filled it halfway with cereal. Milk came after. I'd learned somewhere that the order mattered. I didn't know to whom, but I still followed it. Each morning began like that. Fold the blanket, wipe the counter, check the mail that didn't come. The radio always played Chopin around 7. I waited for that part. I sorted the papers in a shoebox from under the bed. Pension slips. A small investment file. The original deed to the land in Tennessee, a folder marked medical. One bank account still bore only my name, opened long before Greg learned to sign his. I made a list in pencil, erased it, rewrote it in pen, then folded the paper into fourths and slid it into the front of the drawer. On the third morning, I brought out the photo of the wedding. Greg had worn a too-tight tuxedo. Lauren's dress had a satin bow that never laid flat. I sat with the photo across from my plate and wondered how long I had smiled like I belonged in it. After breakfast, I slid it into the drawer behind the utility bill. A knock startled me that Friday. A man with thinning hair and a clipboard held out a flyer about window replacements. I told him I didn't own the place. He looked past me as if measuring the space for something larger than glass. He nodded, muttered about heat loss, then left. I closed the door gently and turned the lock. The blue radio played a cello suite I couldn't name. I let the sound settle. I saw Ed Harper near the courthouse steps on a Wednesday afternoon. He had aged into a leaner version of himself. Hair thinning at the sides, eyes sharper somehow. His briefcase still had that corner scuff from a decade ago. His voice found me before I found the right words. Bonnie. Still in town. Just visiting the air, I said. He squinted at me, trying to measure the space between politeness and curiosity. You look lighter, he said. I don't carry anyone's decisions anymore. That was enough. He offered nothing more. I didn't ask. We parted with a nod. At night, I stacked the books I'd carried. One had a pressed flower inside. I didn't remember which year I'd placed it there. The pages curled faintly at the edges, but the stem held. Greg had called once. I didn't answer. The screen blinked until it gave up. There was a small drawer near the sink that stuck halfway. I kept coins in it. Pennies, mostly. I liked the way they felt dull and warm, like they had stories no one wanted to hear but never forgot. I bought a houseplant. Not out of desire, but because the woman at the market said it was hard to kill. It leaned toward the window like it knew something I didn't. On a shelf above the table, I placed a small ceramic bird I found in a thrift box. Its beak was chipped, the paint flaked near the wings. I liked that it wasn't perfect. It looked like it had made it through something. One evening, I ironed a cloth napkin, not because I needed to, but because it made the table look like someone had intended to sit there. I called the utilities to change the billing address. The woman on the line asked for my relation to the account. I answered independent. She didn't ask again. The street outside had a boy who practiced the trumpet badly. Every Thursday, like clockwork. He missed most notes, but not all of them. I stood at the window and listened, arms folded, not correcting anyone. I found the old envelope with Greg's writing before the signatures, before the documents, with too many lines. The ink had smudged. A note from years back. "Thanks for the help, Mom." I folded it slowly and placed it under the leg of the uneven chair. Lauren never called. I didn't expect her to. There was a moment midweek when I stood with the closet door open, looking at the dresses. One still smelled faintly of citrus soap. I ran my hand down the sleeve, then shut the door. I made soup on the stove with too much garlic. It clung to the walls. I left the window open that night. When I vacuumed, I found a safety pin under the rug, bent slightly. I pressed it flat and placed it in the kitchen drawer next to the spare key and a roll of tape. One morning, I sat with the pension papers again. I circled dates. I underlined lines. I wrote mine in pencil beside the last statement. Then I erased it. The breeze came in sharp that day. I unlocked the window fully. The stack of old documents fluttered. I let them move. One floated to the floor, the one with the words joint ownership. I didn't pick it up. Instead, I turned the radio a little louder. No one was watching. Nothing needed permission. The tea cooled on the table untouched. And I realized I didn't owe anyone an answer for being here. I always believed betrayal would come with noise, raised voices, slammed doors, accusations flung across a room. I was wrong. It arrived sealed in brown paper, folded with precision, and left without a name. Inside the envelope, I found a copy of the household registry stamped with my new address. Beneath it, a single sheet of lined paper, the handwriting clipped and clean. "If you don't sign the revised authorization form, we'll be forced to initiate a psychological review of your condition at your current residence." No signature. Just that line. As if the threat didn't need a face. I laid the paper flat on the counter and ran my fingers along the edge. The corner of the registry curled slightly. Someone had folded it before placing it in the envelope. Someone had taken their time. I didn't move for a while. The radio in the background cycled through a symphony I used to hum while folding laundry. Now it sounded distant, like a memory someone else owned. Later that afternoon, I heard a knock, two short, one long. Greg always knocked that way as a child, like a rhythm only I would recognize. The door opened before I answered. He didn't hug me, didn't ask how I'd been. He placed a manila folder on the kitchen table and remained standing. "You used to trust me," he said, tapping the folder with two fingers. "Let's not make this complicated." The pages inside were dense with legal language. At the bottom, my name printed next to a line waiting for my signature. His initials had already been filled in. I glanced once, then closed the folder. "I'll need time." Greg looked around the apartment. His eyes lingered on the chipped frame above the radio, the teacup turned upside down to dry beside the sink. Then he said, "You could have stayed in the guest room. You didn't need to make this dramatic." I poured water into the kettle without answering. The lid made a soft metallic click as I closed it. He took that as permission to leave. That night, I sat in the dark, the folder unopened on the table. I turned off the radio and listened to the refrigerator hum to the occasional creak from the pipes. Then faintly, a click. Not mechanical, intentional. I traced the sound to the kitchen outlet, the one nearest the window. Behind the faceplate, tucked between wires, was a black device no bigger than a matchbox. A thin red light blinked twice, then went dark. I didn't touch it. I went to the drawer and found my husband's old pocket knife, the one with his initials worn nearly smooth on the handle. I set it beside the device and waited until morning. At dawn, I wrapped the recorder in a cloth napkin and placed it in an empty tea tin. I walked 3 blocks to a diner near the courthouse and sat at a back booth. Ed Harper arrived 15 minutes later, the same quiet steps I remembered from decades ago. He didn't speak right away, just stirred his coffee, glancing at the tin between us. I waited. When he finally looked up, I said, "It's not just about what I own, Ed. He's trying to rewrite who I am." Ed didn't interrupt. He opened his wallet and slid across a business card. "She handles elder documentation cases," he said. I nodded. We ate without another word. 2 people who had once held each other's lives in full view, now reduced to guarded sentences and silent understanding. When I returned to the apartment, I sat at the table and opened the folder again. Each clause carried the same message: relinquish, release, defer. At the bottom of the final page, a note in Greg's handwriting read, "You won't have to worry about any of this again." There was a pen on the table, the same black one I used to write grocery lists, birthday cards, thank you notes. I picked it up and wrote in red across the top margin, "I once raised you to stand. Now you ask me to kneel." Then lower, just above the line meant for my name, I added one more sentence, "I was your mother. You erased that chapter. I folded the paper not to return it, but to keep it. A record not for court, not for revenge, just for truth." Later, I placed the recorder on the windowsill. No wires, no glass jar over it, just exposed for the wind to carry. Then I opened the window wide. The breeze unsettled the pages I had sorted on the floor, statements, forms, old letters. Among them was a card from Greg's high school graduation. "Couldn't have done it without you, Mom." He had drawn a small star above the I in without. I pressed it flat again, then let it go. The tin on the table held only silence now. No wires, no pulse, no red light blinking beneath surfaces. I left it open. I no longer check the mail with expectation. No envelope now carries power unless I allow it. The keys to this apartment jingle differently than the ones before. They don't carry weight, they carry choice. I didn't send a message back. Not yet. I didn't throw anything away. Not yet. I didn't tell Greg what I found. Not yet. But I made one quiet decision. Next time he knocks, I won't open the door. I used to believe quiet was the space between things, between conversations, between footsteps, between meals. Now I know it can be an action all its own. The folder had no logo, no colors, just weight. I kept it under a placemat on the dining table for 3 days, untouched, like a letter from a past version of myself I wasn't ready to open. Inside were the transfer confirmations, a set of numbers, codes, and initials. 17%. Not enough to steer a company, but more than enough to anchor it. And hidden well. Layers of names, legal fog, private hands with no public face. Only one person would ever be able to trace it, and even then, only if he thought to look behind the surface. I didn't tell Ed how many nights I hesitated before signing. He just passed the documents across the table in the diner and said, "No one gets to erase their mother while cashing her checks." Then he asked if I still took cream in my coffee. I didn't answer. When the meeting date arrived, I didn't take a car. I walked 2 blocks, then flagged down a cab and gave the driver the address without saying a word. I wore the beige coat Victor had given me one Christmas back when gifts were about guessing each other right. The lining was frayed under the left pocket, but I didn't mend it. I liked the way my fingers could feel the raw cloth beneath the satin. The conference room was cooler than I remembered. Corporate buildings always have that artificial chill, like the air has never belonged to anyone who actually breathes it. I signed in as representative. No one looked twice. No one looks at older women unless we need help or get in the way. The man in front of me adjusted his tie 3 times. The woman beside him kept checking her lipstick in the reflection of her phone. When the meeting began, my name appeared on the screen once. Small, quiet. Wallace Holdings. New acquisition partner. Greg didn't notice at first. He was too busy speaking in that measured voice he'd picked up somewhere between college and ambition. When the moderator paused to read through the revised shareholder list, I saw Greg's jaw twitch. Bonnie Wallace. He read, puzzled. Greg looked around the room. When his eyes landed on me, there was a moment, just one, when he stopped breathing. Then the folder in his hand slipped an inch down the table. He didn't speak. No one did. I opened my own folder, turned a page, lifted a pen. I didn't write anything. I just let it rest in my fingers. He didn't finish the meeting. One of the junior associates closed in his place. Someone called for a 10-minute break that turned into 20. When the room cleared, I adjusted the sleeve of my coat and left a small envelope on Greg's chair. Inside, one line handwritten. I'm not reclaiming anything. I'm reminding you I was never gone. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't want one. At home, the scissors felt heavier than they should have. I stood in front of the mirror not for vanity, but for clarity. I had kept my hair long out of habit. Once, Greg's voice had echoed behind me while I brushed it. Don't ever cut it, Mom. It makes you look kind. That word had stayed with me. Kind. Not beautiful, not elegant, not sharp. Kind. The kind of woman who waits, the kind who bends her edges inward so no one else gets hurt. I combed it once, then again. Then I cut it, holding the strands in my palm before letting them drop into the sink. No ceremony, no music, just the quiet sound of something being let go. I swept the floor carefully, placing the hair in a paper bag and folding it twice before setting it by the trash. I didn't toss it out. Not yet. But I didn't keep it either. The kitchen smelled faintly of tea leaves. I boiled water and poured it into the same cup I used every morning. There was a crack along the handle that hadn't widened. Not yet. But it would. Everything did in time. The mirror caught the edge of my face as I walked by. Shorter hair, no makeup, a sweater too large across the shoulders. I didn't look like the woman who used to organize family holidays. I didn't look like someone's mother. I looked like a person with no label left to hide behind. I didn't call anyone, didn't send an email, didn't wait for feedback. I folded the beige coat and placed it in the cedar chest by the window. Then I opened the top drawer of my desk and placed the red pen inside next to a notepad with only one page used. There was no applause, no spotlight, just silence. Not the kind that presses against your ears, but the kind that fills the corners of a room and asks nothing in return. I thought of what Greg might say if he ever found the envelope. She's trying to make a point. No, I wasn't. I was making space. I no longer wanted to be seen. I only wanted to be undeniable. And I was. I never thought silence could take up so much space. The notice arrived on a Thursday morning, addressed not to my name, but to a holding company I had never spoken aloud. I opened it with the letter opener I kept from my father's desk. its brass blade dulled with age, the initials RW, still faint beneath my thumb. The contract confirmed transfer of ownership. The house on Maple Ridge Drive was no longer listed under Greg's name, nor Lauren's. The buyer had completed the transaction through escrow, and the payment had cleared. The envelope carried no apology, no request for blessing. Just a date, a signature, and a new reality. I had asked that no plaque be installed, no renovation made to the porch rails I once painted midnight blue with Greg when he was 9. The hedge by the fence would remain. So would the lemon tree, its bark still marked where Greg once carved the word Mom in a shaky 4th-grade hand. I had traced it once after he left for college. That was the last time I found my name written without conditions. The woman who signed the closing documents was named Sylvia. I recognized the last name before I opened the file. Clayton. Her photo was clipped to the final page, paper-clipped neatly. A silver-haired woman with sharp lipstick standing beside a real estate agent who held the ceremonial sold sign like a trophy. I remembered her once from a Thanksgiving long past. She had brought a jar of canned peaches and a smile too bright for the room. Lauren had told her not to make it a habit. "You don't live here anymore," she had whispered when she thought I was out of earshot. When Sylvia reached out for a private meeting, I agreed. We met at a quiet bench outside the county archives building. She handed me a small tin of licorice and a folded paper. "I don't know what you've been through," she said, her voice barely louder than the wind shifting through the trees. "But if you sold that house to me for any kind of lesson, I promise I won't rewrite it." I unfolded the note. She had drawn a map of the backyard circled in red where the lilac bush used to bloom. Then she added, "I'll tend it, just so something still remembers." I looked at her and said only, "It's not a lesson, just a closed room." 2 days later, a formal letter was delivered to Greg and Lauren. The document stated they had 60 days to vacate the property due to invalidated title transfers. The original deed had shown signatures submitted during a lapse in capacity. They challenged it naturally. Greg had always been fond of paperwork when it bent his way. "There's no way this holds." Lauren had told a reporter outside the house, waving the outdated envelope like a flag. "This is clearly elder confusion." The clip was passed to me by Ed. I watched it once. Her nails were pale pink, her earrings gold. She didn't look confused. She looked inconvenienced. I packed a small tin box the next morning. Inside it, I placed a square of cloth from the old dining room curtain, a grocery receipt dated 6 years back with the word Sunday roast underlined twice, and a pinch of soil I had scooped from beneath the mailbox 2 months before the sale. I didn't take pictures. I didn't need them. I wrote one sentence on the inside of the lid in black pen. "This used to be home, but now I belong to myself." The ink bled slightly, curling at the corners like breath on a mirror. I closed the lid without wiping it clean. I kept the box under my bed beside the shoebox of newspaper clippings from years I didn't attend the banquets, but sent pie anyway. There were no ribbons, no certificates, just the folded edges of things someone else might have called proof. A week later, I received a postcard from Sylvia. The handwriting was careful, almost formal. "Moved in. The floors creak in the same spots. I don't mind. The house remembers." There was no return address. I put the card between the pages of my old church hymnal, right after the song Greg had once hummed while brushing his teeth. I hadn't heard that tune in years, but the silence after it had never quite ended. Ed brought over coffee on Sunday. We didn't speak of the sale. He noticed the haircut, nodded once, and poured the sugar without asking. "Some places hold shadows longer than light," he said, his eyes fixed on the chipped rim of his mug. I set a coaster beneath it, one of the few from my wedding registry still intact. The print had faded, but the circle remained. I traced it with one finger. The house is no longer mine. The threshold, the chipped tile by the laundry door, the keyhole that used to stick in the winter. They're someone else's now. Greg will have to find another address to write his name into. I didn't return the keys. I never kept a copy. That night, I placed the envelope from the escrow firm beneath my stack of folded linens. Not to hide it, just to keep it from moving. I sat by the small desk I used to organize my medical records and wrote 3 words on a yellow notepad. Closure needs silence. I didn't tear it out. I didn't sign my name. I folded it in half, placed it inside the tin box with the soil, and pressed the lid shut one more time. The sound it made wasn't final, but it was enough. I no longer glance at the hallway before unlocking my own front door. The morning begins the way it always does now, quiet, deliberate. I let the steam curl from the teapot before I lift the lid. The ceramic is still warm from yesterday's tea. A fine crack runs along the spout hairline and harmless like most of what time leaves behind. I pour slowly, watching the swirl settle in the cup with the faded blue rim. I drink facing the window where thin blinds filter soft light across the table. Beside my mug, there's a half-finished letter, a worn paperback with a sprig of rosemary inside, and the small tin box that holds a clump of dry earth wrapped in waxed paper. No one knocks. No one calls. There are no texts needing replies, no names blinking on the screen that used to tighten something behind my ribs. Silence isn't something I earned. It's something I stopped refusing. The tin box hasn't moved since I brought it home. Inside, the dirt from the old front yard remains the same color it was the day I folded it away. Some people keep jewelry. I kept soil. At the clinic, they say I work too neatly. I align the clipboard's refill pens before they're dry, straighten stacks of documents others skim and discard. No one knows who I used to be. They see a woman who measures time in forms filed and advice given. Most don't even ask for my last name. Greg's does appear sometimes, in emails I don't open. In case summaries passed to me with phrases like client failed to disclose assets or emergency dissolution of board rights. I recognize the language long before I see the name. It's always there, just below whatever apology the sender won't make. Lauren filed her petition quietly. That much I knew from the return address, Sylvia's handwriting, faint but careful, the loops of someone trying not to betray how hard she pressed the pen, not to judge. Sylvia said once, folding her hands across a gray handbag. But I warned her. You didn't warn her, I replied. You waited. We were in the back booth of the corner cafe, where the sugar packets were always sticky. She tried to smile. If you did all this to make them crawl, she muttered. Well, I'd still call it justice. It wasn't for them, I said. It was for the door they shut behind me. Noah and Emily still visit. Once a month, without prompt or guilt. They come with scratched-up board game stories about cafeteria politics, a question about my soup. Do you still write? Grandma Emily asked last time, pulling open my desk drawer. I shook my head. There was nothing to write. The last entry I made was a single line in a notebook with a stitched green cover. I am not here to be remembered. I am here to remember myself. I keep that notebook empty now. A full notebook asks for more. An empty one lets you decide when enough is enough. I cut my own hair now, shorter each month. Not to reclaim time, but to feel the lightness. Greg once said he liked it long. I no longer wonder what he'd think of it now. The last thing he ever left behind was a voicemail I never answered. You could have at least warned me. You didn't have to humiliate me. He mistook silence for surrender. He always did. I made no announcement. I sent no letters. I simply sold the house to Sylvia. She knew what it meant. She kept the porch light, but painted the shutters. Lauren moved in with her eventually. Greg did not. His name was struck from the mailbox, the kind of erasure that doesn't need ink. I never asked for restitution. I never waited for regret. Some reckonings are quiet. Some justice wears no robes. When people speak of him now, it's with a breath caught between sentences. At the legal clinic, we helped a woman last week whose son had drained her retirement without her knowing. She kept blinking at the line item labeled golf trip. She didn't play golf. I just didn't think he would, she said, eyes fixed on the paperwork. I handed her a highlighter. You think you've taught them decency, she said. Turns out you just taught them to smile while they take. I didn't answer. I only passed her a second folder, this one thicker. We closed her case within 3 weeks. She brought a chocolate cake no one finished. The tea on my windowsill cools too fast now. I don't mind. I let it steep stronger than I used to. Some bitterness is earned. There's a folded sheet of paper in my drawer untouched. Blank. I left it there after the house was sold. I thought I might write a letter, explain it all, or mark the ending with words that wrapped it in purpose. I don't think I will. Not because I've said enough, but because I've stopped needing to be heard. I live in a 1-bedroom apartment with squeaky floors and a broken heater that rattles only when it rains. I keep my receipts in a shoebox. My pantry holds 4 cans of soup I like and 1 tin of cookies I never open. I donate what I don't use. Some mornings I press my palm against the window pane and let the cold travel through my fingers. I used to flinch. I don't anymore. In one of the final documents Greg signed, his name was listed below mine for the first time. The attorney had paused, perhaps out of politeness. You'll want to keep a copy for your records. I did. But not out of pride. Sometimes people ask who I live with. I tell them the truth. Just myself. They nod, awkward or impressed. Either way, they move on. I don't. Because the point was never to leave them behind. The point was to stop following. And I have.